over the morning, I've been writing down a few things which have been coming up, and so many more things have come up over in that last discussion. I've got things about, we've talked a lot about, in various applications, about Bayesian belief networks, and there were some questions remaining about that. We've had this issue about complexity, simplicity, the role of data, going from conceptual to models, tools, operationalizing or application. I've got something here about researched application. And I've also written down maybe trying to unpick the fact that, you know, even if you've got multiple frameworks, does every framework and form of framework have to have a different terminology? So it's about thinking not just about how you put it together, but also are we communicating the things in the right way? And I'm sure that other people have got other things. Dave, what have you picked up this morning?
Well, all of that, but also I've one of the things that I was thinking is that we have, you know, a number of different kinds of frameworks. And it was Janet's actually talk that put this in my mind, in that, you know, if we're good sort of rigorous Darwinian scientists here, then by definition only those ones that work or are acceptable to society will survive. And so an argument could be made that with a number of alternative competing frameworks, even though they may use slightly different terminology, that at the end of the day, you know, a clear picture will emerge. I think the second thing that I hadn't really thought about, and terribly guilty until Georgina started speaking, was the consensus that's given to particular frameworks. And it seems to me that there is no merit, probably, trying to get buy-in for a framework de novo that doesn't apply to yours, Janet, but a framework de novo that, you know, somebody think might be completely balmy, when actually several, now tens of thousands of people have signed up to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment as a reasonable framework, not an operational one in any sense, but a framework within which to, you know, view the planet. But I'm also very cognizant, and I bash them about this quite a bit, that people in other cultures may not actually share these ways of looking at the world that can be captured by these box and flow models that we've talked about so far. So,
and just following on that, there is actually a bit of grey literature out there, which I think the title is "Whatever Happened to Differed Sustainable Livelihoods Approach." And if you look at differed literature, it disappeared after, you know, it disappeared completely. It fell off the edge of the cliff. I think it was 2004. It was about then. And talking to people involved in it, it was that at that point in time, that organisation was going into a new way of looking, which was highly economic, and the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework wasn't economic enough for what they needed, and it disappeared. The research community kept it going, but you know what you're talking about, it's a classic example of a really useful framework, and people say, why has it disappeared? Well, it hasn't, but it lost a lot of its credibility with the decision makers because it wasn't giving them what they wanted when their political drivers changed. And I think that's a lesson for us as well.
yeah.
So, comments and questions? Just
Deanna Donovan, JNCC. Yes, I enjoyed all the presentations this morning. It was a nice evolution too. And what struck me is that I thought Georgina brought us back to the beginning, brought us back to Dave's presentation where he started with the ecosystem approach. Because basically she was saying a few things. And one is that the process is important. And in the concept of the process, you're bringing in buy-in or societal choice. You're introducing indigenous knowledge because that's on the ground. And I think that one thing that hasn't come across strongly here enough, although Paul just implied it, is that there was something on the ground before these conceptual frameworks developed. So when you go out, you're dealing with people who are already dealing with those problems of how to maintain their ecosystem services and produce things, live in that environment. And they've approached that in a formulated, complex way already. I mean, it's not that they had no means to do this. It's we're coming with new jargon and new ideas, but we're fitting in. So tapping into what's there, I think, is the sensible approach that Georgina recommended. And yeah, I would just like to say that brings us full circle back to your ecosystem approach and highlights several points there that may have gotten left out as we sort of focused in on ecosystem services.
Yeah. Good job she came. Yeah. We are as one.
Well, but that you know, I'd reiterate that one of the great things for me listening to this morning, or two great things, was thinking from the ESPA perspective how much the community has moved on in 3 years in terms of being able to think about this and to articulate it. But also, despite all of the things which we could say which differed between the talks, there's a very common theme which was emerging. We are actually dealing with similar issues in similar ways. How it gets implemented, how it gets used, some of the theoretical underpinning may differ, but there is a convergence within all of this complexity, which again, when we're talking from moving from the research dimension up to whatever the applications are, whether it is communicating an idea, whether it is an assessment, when it's decision making, that is helpful. There was Pascal, you had a question or a comment from earlier as well.
I'm personally a big fan of pluralism and not trying to converge to a single first best solution or framework. I would slightly take issue with believing in the social Darwinism of frameworks, because I think that ignores a lot of the political economy of how science is produced and reproduced. And I think Paul's comment about sustainable livelihoods and DFID's dropping of it exemplifies it. So I'm not sure that the best ones necessarily survive. There's a whole politics around how that science gets produced and propagated. And it's quite, without it being intended as a sort of particular critique, many of the meta reviews of frameworks tend to concentrate on frameworks that are published in peer-reviewed Western journals. We've lost a lot of complexity and pluralism in simply focusing on those. But those are the ones that are available to us in the worlds that we inhabit. This is the general discussion, and I haven't had the time to engage in detail with the BESS process. But early on, when I was at one or two of the consultation meetings, what I was looking forward to, and I wonder whether that will come through, is the fact that because it is a process that is explicitly trying to look at plurality, and that plurality is getting reflected in the way in which countries are represented in the governing process and so on, that creates a lot of complexity for those who are trying to manage the process. But what it does continually challenge are dominant ways of thinking, because there are alternative voices at the table that suggest that there may be other ways in which we could frame it, and it's not all boxes and arrows and so on. So I'm not necessarily saying that I'm looking to the BESS framework as being the solution, the best alternative, but I think the dialogue that is probably taking place, I hope, is encouraging us to recognize pluralism in those ways. And then I come back to, I suppose, what is in at least what a number of people have been saying. You choose the level of complexity that's appropriate for the questions that you're asking. And you do have to become pragmatic and operational at some point in order to do the science that Roy is talking about. In order to actually convert that into testable, empirically verifiable propositions, you are forced to simplify, and you go with what works for the context. So, but I think the pluralism that lies behind all of it, mustn't ever be forgotten. And I'm not necessarily convinced that the best ones will always emerge from this morass, because there's lots of other stuff happening.
I would certainly sign up to pluralism, and that the more ideas we've got out there that potentially conflict with each other, the richer the conversation. But I think we've also got to accept that if we go down the pluralism route, then do we believe that some frameworks are better than others? And that begs the question, what do we mean by better than? Okay, and there are, I think we can learn lessons by looking at the frameworks that have dropped off the cliff. I mean, sustainable livelihoods is one. Who talks about the 3 pillars of sustainability anymore? No one. Oh, you do? Okay. You're my generation. You see, we were brought up with that. You say that to my students. They look at you as if you come from the Mars or somewhere. Why did that drop off the radar? There are a number of conceptual frameworks we could go back to. And it's because, okay, they did engage, they did unfold discussion, all that kind of stuff, but ultimately they didn't deliver anything. And if conceptual frameworks are going to deliver something, they've got to stimulate science that makes a difference, stimulate knowledge that makes a difference somehow.
Yeah, since the mic's here, I'll respond briefly and then I'll pass it on. So I agree. I think we can ask the question, are some better than others? But that again begs the political economy question, who gets to define what is better and for what purpose? So I think we can ask the question and we can get an answer, but you'll get multiple answers. So you're not going to lose your pluralism.
But Bhaskar, one of your words there was really important, and it's who decides, but it's for what purpose.
Yeah.
And it's that for what purpose, I think, is one of the really important things. Now, yeah.
Joe Morris from Cranfield. Just to comment on the hydrological cycle, of course, it works because it's rather limited, and it is the preserve of a particular scientific community. If the hydrological cycle and the nitrogen cycle and the rest of them had to engage in the rather messy, abiotic, non-natural world, I think it would face a number of challenges. But it does offer an opportunity. It does offer an understanding that can be incorporated in larger models, and perhaps what we're looking for is subsets of understandings that can feed this very complex context. For me, the big challenge with ecosystem services approach is to make the links into the non-natural world and the messiness of governance systems. And we're back to this point, is what's the purpose of the whole exercise in the first place? And I agree with Georgina, it's very context specific, but the model that Janet provides, when I look at that, could fit equally if I wear my Liverpool lenses as my Lilongwe ones. And I've worked in both. So you need a generic framework that would cut the ice and have some resonance. But when it comes down to tools, I think we need to be very specific.
Yeah. Paolo, and then I'll give it to George.
I think I'm getting confused between and I get often confused between pluralism and multiplicity. I mean, I think the world is nice because there's so many things going on, and it's very nice to have the possibility to choose from all the things going on. But when you're addressed a question to you and to your research team, and you have to deliver something that addresses that question or set of questions in a systematic and solid way, then you have to make decisions. And you cannot embrace the whole world. And most probably, you cannot even embrace eventually a strategy or modeling approach which will be somehow richer or be more exciting for you at the end of the day. But for the question that is being addressed, is not going to be inappropriated. With my students, I'll give you the example of Ferrari. Ferrari is a fantastic automobile. And if you are with your girlfriend or your boyfriend, it doesn't matter, and you go from, I don't know, from the casino of Monte Carlo until Cannes, maybe you can enjoy yourself in that automobile. But if you drive from Milan until Lecce, you don't want to drive a Ferrari. Or if you're in somewhere it's in an unpaved road, the few ones that still are left, you don't want to drive a Ferrari because it's unfitted. There's a second part of the Ferrari. It has to do with the fact of the models doesn't fit all the purpose, even if they are so beautiful, etc. The second thing has to do with are you able to drive a Ferrari? So the idea is today you can click the button and the car does everything for you, and you drive like a Fiat Cinquecento, so no worries. But if you unclick the button, most probably after 200 meters, most probably you will have some difficulty to keep the car in stable. So this has to do with also the policymakers. The policymakers, you cannot sell, always in my confused state, a Ferrari to them, but say, look, but whenever you put it on, you have to talk to me. Otherwise, things get messed up. So they have to create a sort of autopilot to them, a button, they can do it. Or alternatively, you go to Maranello and you have three or four classes, and you can do already some kilometers without it being in. So all these things, according to me, are excellent in the sense that there's a pluralism. Anyway, thank you so much. Speaking English as an English is fantastic.
I'm enjoying the analogy.
Yeah, thank you. But you have to make decisions, and those decisions are framed on the questions that be addressed to you, and game over. I mean, and if the questions are differently, then you revisit your scheme, and most probably you'll take different decisions. But that doesn't mean that one is superior to the other. It's one fits the best what is in front of you. And I apologize for being so long before lunch.
Oh, well, I was going to ask, does the color of the Ferrari make any difference?
Well, I think you've also hit very tangentially on another issue. Sorry, Georgina, if I'm stealing your point, but and that's that you've made the point that policymakers and managers often want answers, and actually many of these frameworks have been designed by academics who never provide answers, only more questions, and that's not flippant. That's what we're paid to do. So. We have this saying that wherever 2 or 3 academics are gathered together, you have 5 different frameworks, and they just can't settle on anything at all. And then it's whether you think that's healthy. It's not very useful for the policymaker, I think, but it's probably the way science works.
Yeah. Just before handing over to Georgina, I'll also make another point, is that policymakers want answers, but they have real difficulty in framing the question that they want answered.
Oh, right. Yes, that's true.
And that's right. And quite often the framework helps them to frame the question, which then you need to operationalize, which may require a different conceptualization, etc. But I frequently find that policymakers, the first time they ask me the question, I say, "Are you sure that's the question you're asking?" And then give them the initial thing. Well, no, that's not what I wanted. And it's that. But that illustrates a really key thing: is that when we're talking about going from the research domain into the policy domain, is the cycle of conversations to explore the issues and so forth. So, Georgina.
Oh no, I remember. Yes, okay. So a lot of that has just reinforced this point that it's the context. It depends on the purpose. But actually, it is even more complicated than this. So I'm really glad you brought up Ferraris, on which I have no expertise at all. Which means that for me, it might matter more whether it was a red car than whether it was a Ferrari or not. And of course I would like it to be a red Ferrari, and I'd like it to be in Italy probably rather than the UK. But it's that there's a personal dimension to it which comes from that context. So the point I really wanted to make before Ferraris got me confused was about this question of needing to show that conceptual frameworks work. And I think we need to be really careful about this. Pascal's already pointed out one way in which that may not be a sensible question to ask. But let me give you another way in which it wouldn't be a good question to ask. Supposing it was the case that the problems that had the most successful conceptual frameworks were solved really rather quickly. The framework got the issue, the nuggets, all the elements in there. People went out, did the research, came back, question answered, issue sorted, right? And the framework's gone. So, it could also be that the frameworks that are most persistent are the ones that don't work because people are not able to move them on from the place where they are. Maybe they're too complicated. Maybe they've got the wrong dimensions in them. And that's why I just think this question of a conceptual framework working or not is the wrong one. If it lets you get on and do the piece of work, addressing the key issue that's been put before and which the team agrees on, lets the team work together. If they throw it away at the end, it's worked. If they decide they need to completely restructure it, it's worked. So I really worry about this thing of having the perfect conceptual framework.
Well, I totally agree. I've never seen a perfect conceptual framework, and this whole challenge function is I think that, again, it's about the human dimensions around the framework and what it promotes. I would quite like to pick up some of the other discussion points which came up earlier, which links in with the two which I saw. There was this issue about this continuum between simplicity and complexity, and how we, as researchers particularly, go along that. If we go for this really complex thing, is it useful? Can it ever be worked into research? What's the link to data? I know Janet and Ken Norris are organising our next event in November, looking at the way that ESPA projects are looking at data, etc. And then there's a few examples within the room here, people working on saying, okay, there is a conceptual framework. How do you move from that to link that into the research, the data, the analysis, the models, the tools? And I know from the groups that were within ESPA just how much of a challenge that is. I think those two things would be interesting to explore. So somebody would like to comment on complexity and simplicity in the domains that we're talking about this morning? No. Yeah.
Not so much that, but just where tools sit in that. There was a sort of an idea I picked up this morning that somehow tools is just a simple thing, that you pick up a hammer and you put the picture on the wall kind of thing. But actually, when you think about tools, this is going to sound crazy, they have a lot of theory embedded in them. They've been designed for specific purposes, and it's understanding those purposes that's created the tools. A hammer didn't suddenly come into someone's head. They started off with a rock, and said, that doesn't work kind of very well. I keep hitting my fingers. And these things, design is a kind of theoretically rich and important process. And just to think that we, as the ecosystem service community, we can come up with these tools and let people get on with it is, I think, a bit kind of misguided or very narrow view of what a tool actually is.
Well, to give an example, I heard John Bennington talk about the issue of complexity once, and you could extend this to a tool thing. An example of a tool which encapsulates huge amounts of complexity is an aeroplane. If you thought about the science, the complexity, the mathematics which keeps a modern aeroplane flying, most people wouldn't want to go into the plane. And when you look at it, it's okay, it's looking nice, etc. But the amount that is in that, in terms of science, the engineering, etc., is absolutely phenomenal. I think it was okay, yeah.
I just wanted to follow up on that. Of course, the original aeroplanes were a matter of trial and practice, and then the science is added to the refinement. I've worked most of my life with engineers, and one principle that I was quickly taught was if it worked in practice well and consistently, it was probably right in theory.
Yeah. That's right. Oh, sorry.
I'd just like to sort of separate out in terms of simplicity and complexity that when we're looking at frameworks and models in particular, I think the description of process should be as simple as possible, but the data which describes the local context needs to be as detailed as necessary. And I think there's a distinction there.
Okay. Simply, was it Paolo? Then I want to come back at the end to Bayesian networks. I've got a question.
I mean, the beauty thing about modeling, the art about models, in my view, lies on that specific issue about turning or making something complex somehow tractable. So I would say, as from the moment on, this modeling infrastructure, this modeling landscape is able to embrace that two dimensions in an elegant way. And in elegant ways means that things can be done, and also some information is produced and some advice is. Then I think we should be happy with ourselves. But but I will think this modeling needs, the success of this model needs to, lies in the harmony among those two apparently anyway forces, antagonistic forces.
Okay. Thank you. I want to end up with a technical question. Roy started us off mentioning Bayesian networks. Janet mentioned that we've got the assets project in ESPA, which is using it. And so a number of people have said this is a useful tool in terms of operationalizing some of these concepts. I've been in rooms where this has been talking. The World Bank Waves Initiative is one of these events, and they're looking at that sort of approach and contrasting it with the simplified model, which I put, for example, invest as an example. And the policymakers said, we understand the simplistic model. You know, it's sort of the levers, flows, etc. The Bayesian side, it looks attractive, but we have difficulty understanding how you come up with the answers. So they're actually hesitant on that. So what's good for the research, and I think it is actually a really good research approach, is more difficult to get into this operational side. If we are needing to adopt more new types of approaches, whether it be research or assessment and application, how do we work with these potential users so that they're going to be willing to use that, using, say, Bayesian networks? Ken, what's your experience in getting policymakers to use that sort of, or data from that sort of approach? Or Roy, I should say. Yeah. Sorry, Roy. Ken, good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No. I'm thinking about the next event.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, they're very good for storyboarding, in a sense, you know, and certainly we've worked with non-researchers to develop that. I think it's not so much their complexity. I think the barrier to overcome is this question of uncertainty. I think Bayesian networks, I like them because they're honest in the sense that it does convey this notion of uncertainty, which tools like invest, frankly, don't. Absolutely. You know, and I think if we want to come out of this with some self-respect, we need to sort of build uncertainty into our assessment approaches and so on. And I think Bayesian networks are a way of doing that. So maybe I'm playing the long game. I think what we have to do is to educate the people who go into those positions to understand that, you know, discussion about uncertainty doesn't mean that you don't know anything, but that you're kind of being honest. It's a community building kind of approach, it seems to me.
Paolo and I were at the same meeting where we had this debate, and you know, we're looking at some results from Invest, and looked at the results. You know, it was really definite answer, and everybody looked at it and said, "No, it's complete rubbish." And we could track down to the part of the assumption which was wrong, which was that they were using the universal soil loss equation way outside what it should do. So, you know, I understand why it's rubbish, but it's so compelling rubbish.
Yeah, I think there's two things going on there, and it's one thing. I mean, I have seen attempts at spatially explicit Bayesian belief networks, and they're quite impressive because they produce maps. Maps are political constructs, and Invest produces maps. Everybody believes them. So that's what we do. We trust maps. So that's going on there. But I think your policymakers probably weren't thinking that you talk to all through. I use Bayesian belief networks quite a lot and use it in your sense, for modeling mangrove systems and fish farms in Thailand and places like that. And it works really well. And one of the reasons it works is that it is transparent. Most of the black box models, with the production functions like Invest and other things, actually you can't get to the guts of these, but the kind of models that Roy was talking about, you just click on something and there is the conditional probability table. It tells you, what consensus was reached about the probability of this effect happening. So I think, policymakers are probably a bit scared of that because they probably have too much information. It's too transparent for them. I'm sure if it was just in little circles and you said this is the answer, they'd probably be quite happy with that.
And because of that, in a sense, that transparency and that openness, you can potentially, and this is where I think Bayesian networks are really exciting, build experience back in. So I could imagine, with our simple crazy thing about modeling ecosystem services against habitats, that users would say, well, in my particular place, it's not quite like that. And they would feed back some experience. And then the next generation of the Bayesian network would have that built in. And you could also give people the opportunity to say, well, what evidence do you want in your Bayesian network? Who counts as an authoritative source?
But the other thing that generalizes it is that you can just click on that conditional probability table and you can change it to suit your own system, and you get different answers.
That for me, it illustrates two things. We're at risk of losing lunch, which we won't, but it comes back to the social dynamics around the science, because for the assets team, who are using Bayesian approaches in terms of their ESPA project, one of the times that I saw the most rapid response within the policy context was when one of the modelers who was involved with that was asked to explain what they're doing. He said, "Oh, don't worry about it, just treat it as a black box." At which point it was, right, find us another tool. So I know sometimes it's very difficult for natural scientists to understand the social dimensions of fantastic natural science and how you present this to people, etc. But it's really important. And a lot of what we were talking about then is about that. At which point, lunchtime, and we'll reconvene sharp at 2 o'clock. Is that right, Ruth? Thanks everybody for an absolutely amazing morning. I've learned more than I dared to hope for this morning, so it's been great. Thank you very much.